It's been 12 years since I last had any contact with my father's family. I don't regret it. I'm 32 now, with a completely independent life. But it all started with my father's new wife. My parents divorced when I was around 10 years old. According to them, they simply stopped loving each other. Now that I'm an adult, I understand it, but at the time, it was devastating. I couldn't conceive of the idea that the family I knew no longer existed. My reaction was typical of a confused and hurt child. I got angry, rebelled, and constantly argued with my parents. They tried to help by taking me to family therapy, but I never felt that my father was truly involved in the process. My mother, on the other hand, tried to put herself in my shoes, making me feel understood and supported. My father, however, had a distant attitude, as if he simply accepted what was coming without fighting for anything. That made me gravitate more toward my mother and spend less time with him. However, everything changed when I was 14 years old. My mother died in an accident. I still remember the feeling of absolute emptiness, the certainty that I would never see her again. But the worst part wasn't losing her. It was realizing that I seemed to be the only one in mourning. My father had been dating a woman named Patricia for a few years, and just as my mother died, they announced their engagement. There was no period of mourning, no display of sadness on his part. He simply went on with his life as if my mother had never existed. I felt completely alone. Moving in with him and Patricia was a nightmare. I felt like an intruder in their home, and she made it clear that I had to follow her rules. From the beginning, she tried to take on the role of a mother, but I wasn't going to accept that. I couldn't replace my mom in a couple of months. To make matters worse, Patricia had a son from a previous relationship, Daniel, who was almost my age. But she treated him like a prince. If there was an opportunity to favor him in any way, she took it. She got him a better position on the school's soccer team, secured him the best roles in school plays, and defended him in everything, even when he was wrong. To be fair, Daniel didn't seem to agree with these things. Sometimes he even told his mother to stop meddling in everything. But still, he benefited from her manipulations. Between the loss of my mother, my father's indifference, and the presence of Patricia and Daniel in my life, my adolescence was hell. I knew that the only thing I could do was endure until I went to college. When the time came, I managed to get into the University of Texas, and to save money, I decided to stay at my father's house while I studied. I wasn't living there for free. I paid rent and helped with the household expenses. Everything seemed to be going well until I met a girl named Andrea. Andrea was 31 at the time and was incredible. I fell in love quickly and brought her home several times to introduce her to the family. From the start, I noticed that Daniel had feelings for her. I saw it in his gaze, in his awkward attitude when she was near. I spoke to him privately and asked him to stop acting weird, but his feelings seemed to go beyond a simple passing attraction. At first, I thought that in time his feelings would fade, but the situation worsened. Daniel became obsessed with her. His grades dropped, he lost interest in preparing for his exams, and he seemed completely lost. It wasn't my problem. I wasn't to blame for him being in love with my girlfriend. What I didn't know was that Patricia was aware of everything. In his desperation, Daniel told his mother everything. And instead of explaining to him that he needed to overcome his obsession, she decided that the solution was to break me up with Andrea. One day, my father called me to talk. His tone was serious. He told me that he and Patricia had been thinking about my situation at home and that they needed to make a new arrangement. At first, I thought he was referring to some issue with my friends or that I was making too much noise at night. But then he said it clearly. We know that Daniel has feelings for Andrea, and we believe that the right thing to do would be for you to break up with her for the good of the family. I was in shock. Were they really asking me to leave my girlfriend just because Daniel couldn't control his emotions? Are you kidding me? I blurted out, laughing incredulously. You want me to break up with Andrea because your little boy can't handle a no? I tried to explain to them that I had already spoken with Daniel, that he knew his behavior was unacceptable, and that I barely even brought her home. But they wouldn't listen. They were determined. The discussion turned into a fight. I realized that my father would never put me above his new family. So I made a decision right then. I would leave. I packed my bags and left without looking back. I changed my phone number and spent a few nights at a friend's house until Andrea and I managed to get an apartment together. The university gave me a scholarship, so I only had to worry about rent and utilities. I worked hard, stayed up late, and I made it. After that, I completely cut ties with my paternal family. The only family I considered real were some relatives on my mother's side. And I don't regret it. Now, after 12 years, Andrea and I are married. We have jobs we love and have just bought our first house. We're even planning on having a baby. Leaving my past behind was the best decision of my life. But a few days ago, something happened that made all that pain come rushing back. Daniel showed up at my house. I had no idea how he got my address, but there he was. He said he needed to talk to me. I didn't know how to react, so I let him in. We caught up a bit, but he already knew almost everything about my life, probably from social media. Then he told me the reason for his visit. He confessed that he had been obsessed with Andrea and that his mother had intervened to ensure that I stayed away from her. But then he said something that surprised me. He never wanted me to leave. According to him, Patricia felt relieved when I left. A few months later, they moved to another state. He had no way of contacting me and always felt guilty about what happened. He explained that after I left, his life fell apart. His mother never understood his depression and constantly pressured him to be successful. He ended up dropping out of college and spending years without direction. Now, after a decade, he had decided to seek me out and ask for help. He asked me to help him settle in my city and to try to get him a job at the company where I work. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, seeing him like that made me feel pity, but on the other, I didn't believe I owed him anything. When Andrea arrived home and I told her what had happened, she said that the best thing would be to remain out of contact. However, she also felt that the right thing was to help him in some way. Do I really owe Daniel something? After talking it over with Andrea, I was left thinking about what had happened. I couldn't help but feel torn. On one hand, the idea of getting involved again with someone from my past, especially someone connected to Patricia and my father, made me hesitate. But on the other, I saw Daniel there, his eyes sunken, with an expression that didn't resemble the boy I knew when we were teenagers. He looked broken. Andrea wasn't happy with the idea of letting Daniel back into our lives, and rightly so, yet her kindness has always been one of her greatest qualities. I don't want him back in our life in any way, she told me firmly, but I also wouldn't feel right knowing we're leaving him out in the cold without any help. We decided that the best course would be to offer him a temporary place to stay, but without any promise of helping him beyond that. I wouldn't bring him to my job, wouldn't introduce him to my circle of friends, and I didn't owe him anything more than giving him the chance to find stability on his own. When I told Daniel this, he seemed relieved. He didn't make any dramatic scene. He just nodded and thanked me. I wondered if he had really changed, or if this was just a phase before he dragged me back into the toxicity of my past. We gave him the guest room for a few weeks, and I lent him some money for food while he looked for a job. It wasn't easy. Daniel didn't have a college degree, he had no experience in any professional field, and he had spent years bouncing from one temporary job to another. But to my surprise, he started moving quickly. Within a few days, he got a job at a supermarket as a warehouse assistant. It wasn't a great job, but at least it gave him some stability. It didn't take long for him to be promoted to a supervisor position. It seemed he was really committed to improving his life. However, I still had reservations. Despite seeing him make an effort, I couldn't forget everything that had happened in the past. He had ruined my relationship with my father, forced me out of the house, and although he claimed he wasn't to blame for what Patricia had orchestrated, deep down, he had benefited from it. One day, after he'd been living in our house for almost a month, I had an honest conversation with him. "Daniel, I want to ask you something," I said as we were in the kitchen. "Sure, go ahead," he replied. "Do you really think I owe you something for leaving you in that house with Patricia and my father?" Daniel fell silent. "I don't know," he finally said. "For a long time I felt that way. I felt that if you had stayed, everything would have been different. But I couldn't stay, Daniel. Not after what they did." "I know," he nodded. "Over time I understood. It took me years to realize that you did the right thing, and that I was too weak to do the same." It was the first time I heard him admit something like that. "I don't expect us to become brothers again," he continued, "but I do want to thank you for giving me a chance to start over." That night I spoke with Andrea about the conversation. Although she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, she accepted that he seemed truly remorseful. A few months later, Daniel got a better job at a retail store as a supervisor and enrolled in evening classes to earn his degree. I began to see him in a new light. For the first time in years, I realized he wasn't the same kid I knew when we were teenagers. He had matured, had learned from his mistakes, but there was still something that bothered Andrea and me. Patricia. "Are you still in contact with her?" I asked him one night while we were having dinner. Daniel put his fork down on his plate and sighed. "No," he replied seriously. "I haven't spoken to her in years." "Not even with my father?" "Nothing. They distanced themselves from me when I left the house. To them, I was a failure." Andrea and I exchanged glances. Even though we could never fully forgive what they did to us, at least we knew that he had cut ties with those who had caused us so much harm. In time, my relationship with Daniel improved. I still didn't consider him family in the deepest sense, but I had stopped seeing him as the enemy. He became a more stable presence in our lives. In the end, I never spoke to my father or Patricia again. To me, they remained part of a past I preferred to leave behind. Daniel, however, stayed in our life. And although I will never forget what happened, I can say that at least I learned to close that chapter of my story. Over time, Daniel settled into his new life. He had no intention of staying in our house forever, and he made that clear from the beginning. Although I didn't fully trust him at first, he proved to be serious in his desire to improve. After a few months, he managed to save enough money to rent a small apartment not far from ours. He became independent and started focusing on his evening classes. I won't lie, seeing him work so hard stirred something in me. It was the first time I saw Daniel without Patricia's shadow looming over him. Throughout his life, she had manipulated him, put him above everyone else, and although he always seemed uncomfortable with her favoritism, he never did anything to change it. Now, for the first time, he was on his own, and he was making decisions for himself. One day, while we were having coffee at a cafe near his job, he told me what really happened after I left. "When you left the house, Mom was calm," he said, stirring his coffee without looking me in the eye. "I think she always saw you as an obstacle. It wasn't that she hated you, but she saw you as a problem that needed to be solved." "And my father?" Daniel shrugged. "The same as always. He never made a decision for himself. If Mom said something was right, then it was. If she said something was wrong, Then he accepted it. When you left, he didn't say anything. He made no effort to find you. It was as if you had simply ceased to exist. I felt a knot in my stomach. Although I'd left all that behind years ago, hearing that my own father had erased me so easily caused an unexpected pain. After you left, the house felt strange, Daniel continued. It was never a home, but without you there, everything was colder. I realized that I had no one. Even though we were never close, at least when you were there, I felt that someone understood me a little. I fell silent. I didn't know what to say. But the worst part was seeing how Mom just kept living her life as if nothing had happened, he said with a sad smile. As if everything had gone exactly as she planned. That didn't surprise me. Patricia was never someone who felt any guilt about anything. Over time, she started pressuring me more. No matter what I did, it was never enough. If I got good grades, she said I had to do even better. If I tried to go out with friends, she found a way to make me feel bad for leaving her alone. And when I started to fail, she had no compassion. She just called me useless. It was ironic. Patricia had built her life around making Daniel special, better than everyone else. But when he stopped living up to her expectations, he became a failure in her eyes. At some point, I just stopped trying, he admitted. I gave up. I got involved with the wrong people, wasted years of my life, and ended up with nothing. He took a sip of his coffee, and then looked at me seriously. That's why I came looking for you. Not because I think you owe me anything, but because you managed to get out of all that. I didn't. I took a deep breath. At that moment, I understood that Daniel wasn't just the guy who had complicated my life when we were teenagers. He had also been a victim of Patricia, of her obsession with controlling everything. But that didn't mean I was obligated to save him. Daniel, let me be clear with you, I said firmly. I helped you because it seemed like the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean you can depend on me forever. You have to learn to stand on your own. He nodded. I know, and I appreciate it. For the first time, I felt like I was speaking to him as an adult, as someone who finally understood the consequences of his actions. From that day on, things changed. Our relationship evolved from being an obligation to something more natural. We weren't close, but I no longer saw him as someone I had to distrust. Andrea, for her part, remained cautious. Although Daniel had privately apologized to her for his past behavior, she still found it hard to feel completely comfortable with his presence in our lives. However, over time she began to accept him. I'm not going to say that I completely forgive him, she told me one night while we were in bed, but I do think that, after everything, he wasn't really the villain of the story. That role belongs to Patricia, I replied with a bitter smile. Andrea sighed. I hope she never reappears. I hoped so too. But with Patricia, you never knew. Fortunately, we never heard from her or my father again. I didn't look for them, and they never tried to contact me. I don't know if they're still together or if they ever wondered what became of my life. But honestly, I don't care anymore. Daniel remains in our life, but in a healthy way. He's advanced in his job, made new friends, and seems to be building a better life for himself. As for me, I'm happy with Andrea. We're still together, still building our life, and although this reunion with Daniel brought back painful memories, it also made me realize how fortunate I am. I never thought I'd see my former half-brother again, much less that we'd find a way to make peace. But here we are, and although the past can never be changed, we can choose how we want to move forward. Now, leaving behind the story with Daniel and my father's family, I want to tell you what happened with my best friend, Sarah. My husband Michael and I have been married for 5 years, and honestly, our relationship has been wonderful. But recently, an unexpected experience with Sarah changed many things in my life. Sarah and I met in college and became inseparable. We spent summers together, went to concerts, explored the city, and always supported each other in everything. Even after graduating, though we took different paths, I became a lawyer and she decided to work in social media, we never stopped making time to see each other. When Sarah asked me to organize her baby shower, I felt honored. I was going to be the baby's godmother and wanted to make sure that everything was perfect for her. We chose a theme in shades of yellow, her favorite color, and I coordinated with the best catering company I knew. I made sure the decorations were beautiful, the food was perfect, and that the entire event was special for her. But what happened at the party was something I never imagined. On the day of the baby shower, everything was going well. Michael and I had arrived early to take care of the final details. Sarah was getting ready in another room as the guests gradually arrived. There were friends from college, family members, and many familiar faces. Everyone was excited to celebrate with her. When Sarah finally appeared, she looked radiant in a yellow dress that matched the theme. Everyone congratulated her and she smiled, enjoying the attention. During the meal, everything proceeded normally until Sarah decided to give a speech. She stood up, raised her glass, and thanked everyone for being there. But then, her expression changed. "Today I want to share something very special with you," she said with a big smile. "This baby is not only the result of the love between Mark and me, but I also have to thank someone else." She paused dramatically and then pointed directly at my husband, Michael. "The father of my baby is Michael." A deathly silence fell. My heart stopped for a moment and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked at Michael, who had an expression of complete confusion. He squeezed my hand under the table, as if trying to reassure me that this wasn't a dream. Murmurs began to spread among the guests. People looked at Michael and me in disbelief, while Mark, Sarah's husband, appeared utterly perplexed. I tried to process what she had just said, but before I could react, Sarah burst into laughter. "It's a joke, guys," she exclaimed between laughs. "This is all a joke for my Instagram. I set up cameras all over the room to capture your reactions." Some people let out nervous chuckles, but most remained silent. I was paralyzed. I couldn't believe that Sarah thought such a prank was funny. Michael was visibly uncomfortable. I felt his hand tremble slightly as he let go of mine. Mark wasn't laughing. In fact, his expression reflected anger and shame. "Sarah, what the hell did you just do?" he asked in a low voice but with a tone full of fury. Sarah still had a smile on her face, but when she noticed Mark's reaction, her expression changed. "Oh, come on, Mark. It was just a joke." "A joke?" he replied incredulously. "Telling everyone that my wife is pregnant with another man in front of our entire family and friends is a joke." The atmosphere in the room became unbearably tense. Most of the guests didn't know what to do or say. Michael stood up from the table and whispered to me, "I can't stay here. I'm going to wait for you in the car." I watched him leave without saying a word. I knew he was embarrassed and hurt. Mark and Sarah began arguing in hushed voices, but everyone could hear what they were saying. "I can't believe you did this," Mark said, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "How did you think it would be funny?" "It's not a big deal," Sarah insisted. "It was just a joke for my content." "Content?" Mark raised his voice and all the guests fell even quieter. "Sarah, this was our baby shower, not some damn recording for your Instagram." She tried to calm him down, but he was too upset. "I'm done with this. It's over, Sarah." Sarah's crying filled the room, but Mark remained unmoved. He left the house without looking back. I got up too. I couldn't stay there any longer. Without saying a word to Sarah, I walked to the door and left. When I got home, I found Michael sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting beside him. "I don't know what was worse," he said without looking up. "The shame of everyone staring at us, or the humiliation of having someone we considered a friend do something like that." I hugged him. "I'm never going to forgive her for this," I whispered. Michael nodded. "Neither will I." The next day, Sarah sent me multiple messages. She said she didn't understand why I was so upset, and that it had only been a joke without any bad intentions. I didn't respond right away. I was too angry. But when I saw that she sent another message asking me to accompany her to her appointment with the gynecologist, I felt that she had crossed the line. I replied firmly, "Sarah, what you did wasn't a joke. It was cruel and humiliating. I don't want to talk to you right now." Her response left me in shock. "You're a bad friend for abandoning me when I'm so vulnerable. You've always been jealous of me and my pregnancy." My hands trembled with rage as I read her words. How dare she say that after everything I had done for her? I showed it to Michael, who immediately said, "Block her. Don't let her manipulate you." And that's what I did. I deleted her number and blocked her from all my social networks. I don't regret having done it. Over the following days, people stopped talking to Sarah. Her prank not only cost her her marriage, but also ruined many of her friendships. And although part of me felt sorry for her, I knew it wasn't my problem. Sometimes people change in ways you'd never expect. And when someone shows you who they really are, the best thing you can do is believe them. Days passed, and even though I tried to move on with my life, the feeling of betrayal lingered. I couldn't believe that Sarah, my best friend for over a decade, would put me through something so humiliating and then have the nerve to call me a bad friend for distancing myself. Meanwhile, Mark was dealing with his own battle. After that disastrous party, he decided to go ahead with the divorce. Sarah, of course, didn't take it well. One afternoon, Michael received an unexpected message from Mark. He invited us to dinner because he wanted to speak with us in person. When we arrived at the restaurant, Mark looked exhausted. His eyes were dark with bags, and he seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. "Thanks for coming," he said, sighing as he leaned on the table. "I know all of this has been a disaster, but I wanted to tell you what's happened since then." Michael and I exchanged glances. We were curious. "Sarah has been calling me non-stop," he continued. "She sends me messages every day, begging me to come back. And when I don't respond, she starts accusing me of ridiculous things." He paused before adding, "She even said I left her because I was in love with your wife." I let out an incredulous laugh. "What? That makes no sense." Mark rubbed his face with his hands. "I know. But Sarah isn't the person we used to know. I don't know when she changed so much." I sighed and looked at Michael. All of this was becoming more chaotic than I had imagined. "And what do you plan to do now?" I asked. "I'm going to go through with the divorce," he replied without hesitation. "I don't want anything to do with her anymore." He told us that he had been saving all of the conversations and messages from Sarah as evidence for the legal process. His lawyer advised him not to respond to any of her accusations and simply to gather proof of her erratic behavior. "What hurts me the most is the baby," he admitted sadly. "I don't want her growing up in the middle of this mess." Michael and I didn't know what to say. It was a complicated situation. After that dinner, things became even tenser. Sarah kept trying to contact me by any means possible. Since I had blocked her on my phone and social media, she started sending emails. At first they were just messages asking me to talk, to stop overreacting. But then they became more aggressive. In one of them she told me that I had always used her, that she never truly considered me her friend, and that Michael had never really loved me. That was the last straw. I knew that Sarah was desperate and probably trying to hurt me because I no longer wanted her in my life, but reading those words made me feel an anger I had never felt before. I showed Michael the email, and, without hesitation, he deleted it. "Don't let it get to you," he said calmly. "She just wants to manipulate you into reacting." And he was right. From that moment on, I decided that I wouldn't allow Sarah back into my life. The divorce and Sarah's fall. A couple of months later, Mark finally obtained the divorce. Sarah tried to fight for a large financial settlement, but thanks to the prenuptial agreement they signed before getting married, she ended up with almost nothing. Her presence on social media also began to crumble. After the baby shower incident, many people stopped following her. Several of our mutual friends cut ties with her, and some of her followers started to question her seriously. One day, someone sent me a link to one of her videos. In it, Sarah was crying in front of the camera, saying that she had lost everything and that her supposed friends had abandoned her in her darkest moment. I felt embarrassed for her. She still wouldn't take responsibility for her actions. She didn't mention the baby shower prank, nor did she talk about everything she had done to Mark or me. She simply presented herself as a victim. I turned the video off before it finished. I didn't want to give her any more of my attention. My life after Sarah. Despite everything that happened, Michael and I decided not to let that experience ruin our present. A few months later, we went on vacation to the Maldives. It was our way of leaving behind all the toxicity of the past few months. While we were on the beach, watching the sunset with a couple of cocktails in hand, Michael took my hand and said, "Sometimes, life makes us go through these things to remind us what kind of people we want in our lives, and which ones we don't." He was right. Sarah had been an important part of my past, but that didn't mean she had to be a part of my future. Since then, I've learned to be more selective about the people I call friends. And, above all, I've learned that when someone shows you who they really are, the best thing you can do is believe them. Days went by, and, even though I tried to move on with my life, the feeling of betrayal lingered. I couldn't believe that Sarah, my best friend for over a decade, would put me through something so humiliating and then have the nerve to call me a bad friend for distancing myself. Meanwhile, Mark was dealing with his own battles. After that disastrous party, he decided to proceed with the divorce. Sarah, of course, didn't take it well. One afternoon, Michael received an unexpected message from Mark. He invited us to dinner because he wanted to talk to us in person. When we arrived at the restaurant, Mark looked exhausted. His eyes had dark circles, and he seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. "Thanks for coming," he said, sighing as he leaned on the table. "I know all of this has been a disaster, but I wanted to tell you what has happened since then." Michael and I exchanged glances. We were curious. "Sarah has been calling me non-stop," he continued. "She sends me messages every day, begging me to come back. And when I don't respond, she starts accusing me of ridiculous things." He paused before adding, "She even said that I left her because I was in love with your wife." I let out an incredulous laugh. "What? That makes no sense." Mark rubbed his face with his hands. "I know. But Sarah isn't the person we used to know. I don't know when she changed so much." I sighed and looked at Michael. All of this was becoming more chaotic than I had imagined. "And what do you plan to do now?" I asked. "I'm going to move on with the divorce," he replied without hesitation. "I don't want anything to do with her anymore." He told us that he had been saving all of the conversations and messages from Sarah as evidence for the legal process. His lawyer advised him not to respond to any of her accusations and simply to gather proof of her erratic behavior. What hurts me the most is the baby, he admitted sadly. I don't want her growing up in the middle of this mess. Michael and I didn't know what to say. It was a complicated situation. After that dinner, things became even tenser. Sarah kept trying to contact me by any means possible. Since I had blocked her on my phone and social media, she started sending emails. At first they were just messages asking me to talk, to stop exaggerating. But then they became more aggressive. In one of them she told me that I'd always used her, that she never truly considered me her friend, and that Michael had never really loved me. That was the last straw. I knew that Sarah was desperate and probably trying to hurt me because I no longer wanted her in my life. But reading those words made me feel an anger I had never felt before. I showed Michael the email, and, without hesitation, he deleted it. "Don't let it affect you," he said calmly. "She just wants to manipulate you into reacting." And he was right. From that moment on, I decided that I wouldn't allow Sarah back into my life. The divorce and the fall of Sarah. A couple of months later, Mark finally got the divorce. Sarah tried to fight for a large financial settlement, but thanks to the prenuptial agreement they had signed before getting married, she ended up with almost nothing. Her presence on social media also began to crumble. After the baby shower incident, many people stopped following her. Several of our mutual friends cut ties with her, and some of her followers started to question her seriously. One day, someone sent me a link to one of her videos. In it, Sarah was crying in front of the camera, saying that she had lost everything and that her so-called friends had abandoned her in her darkest moment. I felt secondhand embarrassment. She still wouldn't take responsibility for her actions. She didn't mention the baby shower prank, nor did she talk about everything she had done to Mark or me. She simply presented herself as a victim. I turned the video off before it finished. I didn't want to give her any more of my attention. Throughout my life, I've faced betrayals, manipulations, and difficult situations with both my family and my friends. But in every one of these moments, I've always made the same decision: to distance myself from what harms me. Whether it was my father, Patricia, Daniel in the past, or Sarah, I learned that no matter how long you've known someone, if that person constantly hurts you, you have no obligation to keep them in your life. Today, Michael and I are still together and happy. Our relationship grew stronger after everything that happened because, at the end of the day, we know that the most important thing is to surround ourselves with people who truly value us. As for Mark, he is moving on with his life, focusing on being the best father possible for his daughter. And Sarah, well, I doubt I'll ever hear from her again. But if there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that there are people who, when they hit rock bottom, instead of changing, prefer to sink even further. I'm just glad that I won't be there to witness it.